Welcome back to the Tour Today show. My name is Steve Fleck. Every day there is racing at the Tour. We will talk about the highs and the lows, the thrills and the spills, the tragedies and the triumphs at the Tour, aka La Grande Boucle. On each episode of the Tour Today, I will have a special guest on the show with me. Today, I'm pleased to have with me former Canadian national team cyclist and now sports nutritionist. Welcome, Ann Guzman.
Hey, Steve. How are you?
I am good. Great to have you on the show. I know we're going to get into the sports nutrition big time. I know it's what you do professionally, and I've had a number of questions sort of offline, sort of about this show in particular, because it's always a bit of a mystery with fans, casual recreation, even semi-serious riders as to what goes on with the nutrition for the riders in big multi-day stage races like the Tour de France. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in and watching us on the Tour Today show. You can find me on Twitter at Steve Fleck. That's probably the best spot to send comments or questions. And where can they find you? I know you're big on Twitter. We've gone back and forth on many Twitter exchanges and messages. Where can they find you on social media?
Yeah, absolutely. At Guzman Nutrition. And as you say, it's probably my most active location, and that along with the Pro Kit.
Fabulous. Well, thank you for tagging me. You always tag me on so many posts, and they're great questions and a commentary that comes up after that on those posts on Twitter where you tag me. I really appreciate that. Well, it was stage 14 today, Anne, but before we get to what happened today, some controversial events from yesterday. Romain Bardet, one of the big hopes for France. He has been in the top 5, top 10 numerous times on the overall in the GC at the Tour de France over the last number of years, had to pull out of the race. He was concussed. He did go down in a big pileup, about 80 kilometers to go in the stage yesterday. Some other favorites in the race, Boca Mollema from the Trek Segafredo team and Nero Quintana also went down in that crash. Bardet was on the ground for what seemed like too long a time. No one ever saw the crash on camera, but there were images of him staggering around trying to get back on the bike and get going. He ended up finishing the race, and then the controversy erupted because it was concluded and that he did have a concussion sort of after or during the race in that crash, yet finished the race. He was only 2 minutes down at the finish. What's your feeling on that? Should he have finished? Should he not have finished? I know there is protocols in place right now for concussed cyclists, in races. What's your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I didn't see the actual crash. I think you mentioned as no one actually saw the actual crash. So I guess it's a little difficult when you come up on the rider if they are awake, and I'm not sure if that was the case. Like, did they show that he was literally knocked out? In which case, I'm really surprised if he had difficulty even standing, that he was allowed to get back on the bike. And I know sometimes, it's the Tour de France, it's the heat of the moment, the athlete wants to go, but to me, I think it's a responsibility of the team around him and the organization to think bigger about the rest of his life when he can't even keep his balance to get on a bike. Like, that head injury could resolve quickly, but it could be long lasting, and the damage could be a lot worse when you get on and continue right after, especially 80 kilometers and the intensity that you're doing in a bike race. So for me personally, having experienced concussions and having seen fellow athletes careers ended, I take it super seriously. And again, I know it's really difficult. It's the Tour de France, but I just think you have to think of the human being first over the result, and you only get one brain.
Absolutely. And I know various sports organizations, whatever the sport, and cycling, the sport here we're talking about is cycling, whether it be provincial sports organizations or national sports organizations, Cycling Canada, the Ontario Cycling Association, they have new concussion protocols in place. And there have been some riders of reasonable profile that have had to sit out a period of time after knowingly being concussed in a race from a crash or a training crash, and they've had to sit out. They've not been allowed to race. And I would agree with you, and I agree with those sports associations and those new protocols, that is the acceptable and proper thing to do. Knowing what we know now about the long-term effects of even minor brain injury, I think that's the smart thing to do. Just sit tight for a second, Ann. We'll get to get to you and the nutrition discussion shortly. The stage today from Clermont-Ferrand all the way to Lyon, 197 kilometers. There was one second category climb, the Col de Biel, and then a long downhill run into Lyon allowed this pretty much the pack, the main pack, to stay together. There were two brutal climbs within the city of Lyon within the final 10 kilometers that factored in the outcome. From the get-go, Bora Hansbrough wanted to make this about Peter Sagan and his chase for that elusive 8th green jersey. They wanted to put the current holder of the green jersey, Sam Bennett from the Dunisac Quick-Step team, on the ropes, and they did early on. So they made the early pace brutal and hard, and they were able to break Sam Bennett, and he dropped back a number of minutes. So eventually Bennett was back 2 to 3 minutes, and that was kind of setting it up for Peter Sagan to get the maximum points at the intermediary sprint and then hopefully win the race to get maximum points at the finish line. But Team Sunweb had other ideas, and they did textbook counterattack, attack, counterattack over the final 5 to 10 kilometers on that tough terrain within the city of Lyon. And Søren Kragh Andersen came through for a win for Team Sunweb, spoiling Peter Sagan's quest to get maximum points on the finish line. Sagan ended up in 4th spot. Luka Medzik from the Mitchelton Scott team was 2nd. Simon Cosanoni from the Cofidis team was 3rd. Sagan, as I mentioned, was 4th. So quick summary on the jerseys. Nothing changes with regards to yellow. Primož Roglič will stay in yellow once again. Sam Bennett, as mentioned, still in the green jersey. Sagan was able to get back points on him, and I think really the Bora Hansbrough team will be racing completely for Sagan to try and get that green jersey back before they get to Paris. So Sagan getting back some points on Bennett. He is in 2nd spot in the green jersey. Tadej Pogačar, the Slovenian sensation, the 21-year-old Slovenian sensation, still in 1st in the white jersey. Benoit Cosnefroy, another young sensation of this tour from AG2R, remains in polka dots in the KOM, and EF Pro Cycling is still in 1st place in the team competition. Tomorrow, Stage 15, 175 kilometers on a run from Lyon deep into the French Alps, and then a climb up the Grand Colombier. It is a huge and massive climb at the finish, 20 kilometers of uphill at the finish, averaging 7.1%, with some ramps at 15%. The final 200 kilometers to the 200 meters, I should say, to the finish is at over 15%. So tough stage tomorrow, 3 big mountain climbs, and then a massive climb up the Grand Colombier. And we're going to have another big GC battle on our hands tomorrow. Back to you, Anne. Q&A.
Yeah, I've ridden that finish climb, by the way.
You have? You've ridden the Grand Colombier. Wow.
Yeah, I mean, not in a race or anything, but yeah, when I was in France just riding, it's phenomenal. And I remember thinking to myself, gosh, these guys do this in the big ring, like some parts of it, like at that time, like gearing might have changed since my day racing. But yeah, that's what I was thinking in my mind, because I certainly was not doing it in the big ring.
Well, that's great. You got personal experience on the Grand Colombier. It will factor significantly, I'm guessing, in the outcome to tomorrow. So I guess the first big question, Anne, on sports nutrition was something like the Tour de France. I mean, they're riding 150 to 200 kilometers a day, climbing massive mountains. Some stages are flat, speeds are high. They're doing this day in and day out with 2 rest days for 3 weeks. How do they stay on top of the caloric needs for something like this?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I don't have firsthand experience, but of course I've read a lot of secondhand experience with the team dietitians, team physiologists, and even, research that's done on average rider weight and average energy expenditure. So it seems like overall, on average, they're expending like 5,000 to 8,000 calories per day during these stages. So maybe the flatter ones, maybe expending less, and certainly an easy day, but in the mountain stages, expending more. And it's a job, right? The nutrition is a job, and it's certainly something that I would presume, has been dialed in at least 3, 4, 5, 6 months before the tour even starts. But yeah, huge job. It's going to make or break your performance. You can't get behind, because catching up would be detrimental. And as you know, one bad day on the bike in the tour significantly changed the GC, so really staying on top of that. But when you think about the time that the riders are actually racing, and then how much time is left now to make up for a lot of that expenditure, like time becomes very crucial. So the timing of a, pre-race meal, and then snack before, and then everything you're consuming on the bike. And, these teams, most of them have professional chefs, probably too, sports dietitian, and they're waiting in those trailers and buses with recovery, hydration, nutrition, as soon as they're available in the bus to get started, because they're finishing those stages pretty late, and then there still has to be a dinner after that recovery meal. So it really is, it would be really difficult, and eating that much would become difficult. So you've raced, I've raced, we've done stage races, Pauline has done them. It becomes a bit of a job. And it takes real diligence. Gladly, they have amazing teams supporting them and keeping them on track. And I'm sure they'll have goals that they're reaching to make sure they're eating enough to maintain their weight, maintain their energy, recover their hydration, their electrolytes. I mean, it's such a big deal. It's going to make or break performance.
So there's several different components to this, and I agree with you. It's almost like a job, because the caloric demands are you almost have to sort of force feed yourself, in the time off the bike. So the components I see are, there's the time on the bike, and because of the length of the stages, your body can't store enough carbohydrates as energy, so you have to take things in. So that's one component. And then there's the before and the after that you mentioned. The before the race, the breakfast in the morning, and then the dinner in the afternoon. And the thing that often throws a lot of people off is we watch these stages that take place, for us, early in the morning to sort of middle of the day, kind of thing. But for TV, like over in France, these stages start middle of the day. So they're not finishing up until late in the afternoon. And I'm sure that kind of throws things off as well. So let's break that down. Let's first talk about what would they be eating on the bike? Like what is the sort of the routine sort of on the bike? We see them getting handed up water bottles, and the musettes, the bags get handed up to them. What sort of things would they be eating on the bike during the stage?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, definitely a variety of foods in the musette. And for anyone who doesn't know, the teams are handing these bags, and they could have sandwiches, jelly sandwiches, rice bars are really popular. I would assume that some teams are maybe using potatoes because they're easy to digest and they don't get sticky, they don't melt, they don't freeze. And then, of course, like sponsored products, so bars, gels, chews. And typically, early in the race, if there isn't a lot of intensity, probably focus more on the solid foods. And then, as the mountains are coming, or there's more intensity coming, it's more difficult to be chewing when you're out of breath. So
Right.
literally just the practicality of it, you would be, going more with sports drinks and gels and things that are easy to swallow quickly. So there's always that aspect of it as well. But yeah, a huge variety of foods. I would assume different riders have different likes, and this is not the time where they're trying new things. So I'm certain in camps that they've all eaten these foods before, and they know what they're going to be eating, and that their GI tract can tolerate it. And definitely hydration is a huge deal. I mean, again, it's a lot of hours out on the bike. Everyone has a individual sweat rate, and whether they lose a lot of sodium or they lose a lot of water, or they lose a lot of both. So that's, again, something that would be really dialed in with the team working with each athlete to make sure that their needs are being met. And so I would assume most of them have a sports drink in there. And that also helps with palatability. So if you like the taste of your drink, you're going to drink more. And then it allows you to eat a little less solid food, right? So if you're eating 90 grams of carbohydrates per hour, but now you can drink 30 or 40, now that means, okay, you can eat a little bit less solid food, and that might be easier for some riders versus other. And there's always a personal preference in there, right? Some people might like eating more, some people might like drinking more. So yeah, they would be consuming such a variety of foods. But the main thing is that they're easy to digest carbohydrate foods, right? Because as you mentioned, you have that limited capacity to store. So you have to make sure that you don't deplete that glycogen, which is your stored carbohydrates. You're trying your best to stay on top of that for when the throttle does go down, you can respond to that intensity.
So it's important to remember that this is not just a one-day, one-off 150 to 200 kilometers. You got to do this every day for 3 weeks, 2 rest days. And I know that hour, that 90 minutes after you finish the race or the training, on that day, is kind of like the golden time to set you up and get you ready to go for the following day. So what are they, when they, finish, they cross the finish line, they're going to the team cars, team buses. You often see them get it handed something right away by the soigneurs as they get across the finish line. What are they possibly having at that point?
Yeah, I would presume like rehydration is a really important factor at that point. So right away getting in either water with electrolytes or a sports drink to start the rehydration and replace any lost electrolytes. The heat doesn't look too intense there, but again, that's such an individual thing. I would assume, and also it really depends on, the state of the rider, right? So maybe you're in the middle of a peloton, it wasn't the worst day, but if you just did the hardest day of the tour for you, your condition might determine the type, or, are you going to drink something? You're going to eat something. Maybe you can't handle that because you're just so wasted. You just need to drink it. There's probably going to be a protein in some of those drinks as well to help repair. There's a lot of muscle damage going on. They're expending a lot of calories. The protein intake is probably higher than the recreational athlete, or, probably up near even 2 grams per kilogram. So recovery drink with carbohydrates, protein, definitely rehydration is a huge priority. And then after that, I would assume they're also eating right then, because as you said, if they're finishing at 5:30 p.m., like you really need to take that opportunity to start replenishing glycogen. And then again, you're probably going to eat dinner at like 9 p.m. Right? So you need to give that time to digest in between. So getting on that right away is crucial. And then also your body is, there's some enzymes that are elevated in your blood when you deplete your glycogen that make you more able to store glycogen quickly. So physiologically, it's a good time as well. So, but the big thing is that you're eating right away, drinking right away, and then having time to digest so you can do it again, and then again before bed. Right. So you're topping off that one more time. So again, it really comes down to maximizing your time, spreading it out as well as you can so that you can digest and not run into gastrointestinal problems. And then again, it's amazing that they have all of that support in the chefs. And we'll probably get to this, but I think the variety of food probably becomes very important as well over 3 weeks.
Well, yeah, I mean, you're literally, you don't want to be eating the same thing. And we always sort of envision plates and plates and plates of pasta, but, maybe they don't like pasta, or, they get bored of the pasta, but they have to keep something, going in. So what typically, when they sit down to dinner, like what would dinner look like, just sort of generally?
Yeah, I've read some information from the Sunweb dietitian, and I think also Team Scott, missing the other half of the sponsor name there, and what specifically they had. So there's a huge variety. I mean, there's lean protein, usually, chicken or fish, and they do have salads and whatnot from what I've read of some of the descriptions, and definitely rice, potatoes, pasta, as you mentioned, and even juices. Right, because you need a lot of carbohydrates, but the volume of food you have to be careful with, because if you're eating all this in broccoli, I mean, it's not going to be sustainable. It's too much volume and not enough caloric density.
Right.
So you need those calorically dense foods, and that's where the potatoes and even quinoas, and again, they have chefs, right? So the flavor and the taste of those combinations that they're making. I think I was reading, that one of them was, they're always using bouillons and things that actually give good flavor so that they want to eat, because it can be exhausting to eat yet another plate. Maybe some of them have amazing appetites too, right? There's always that. But so a huge variety. I'm sure there are salads and probably more of that on the easier days. But you always have to keep in mind, have to get the food in. So what's the best way to do that without feeling too full? And that's probably where juices and even vegetable juices come into the picture, which may not be things that they are consuming outside of the Tour de France. Orange juice or whatnot might be top of their list, but this is a different circumstance where, you do what you can to get the carbohydrates in, and of course, meeting the protein needs as well.
Right. So then the riders go to sleep, hopefully have a good night's sleep, and then they're up the next morning, and then it's breakfast, and then usually a mid to late morning, or usually around mid-morning, closer to noon is the start for the next stage. So what are they having for breakfast? And then I know coffee's really, coffee's really big with cyclists sort of in general. I often see the riders, having an espresso in the depart area where they have there's catering services, available to them. So first, what would they be having for breakfast? And then the whole coffee thing, what would they be having the coffee for?
Yeah, so I'm sure the timing is probably approximately three to four at the most, 3 hours before a race start, that they would have like a large breakfast with, again, a predominant focus on carbohydrates, but also protein. So you have to think about just the sheer amount of food that's being consumed is also going to naturally increase the protein intake. Sometimes we forget that, potatoes and oats and all those things also have protein in them. So, but again, predominantly like a high carbohydrate intake. Most of them are probably consuming 9 to 10 grams per kilogram of body weight. So I think I saw a 2012 study, the average weight of a Tour de France rider was 155 to 165. So in kilos, that's, I think, like, I don't know, around 70 something, 75.
Yeah, a little bit less than 70, a little bit more. Yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, you're talking over 700 grams of carbohydrates a day. And to put that in perspective, wow, a cup of rice is 40 grams, yeah, right? So it could be up to 800 grams. You just have to think that's a lot of rice. So definitely, again, a high focus on the carbohydrates and some lean proteins. And of course, you're going to have some fat in there as well, but that's not the biggest focus. But I'm sure they're eating 140, 50 grams of fat per day. So oatmeal, cereals, juices. I'm sure there's some milk and eggs in there as well. Good polyunsaturated fats, nuts, seeds, but a high focus on carbohydrates again. And you mentioned, eating again, and I think I would presume that the bus ride, or their, bus, I mean, they have a lot nicer than a bus, but the ride to and from the event serves as a good time for fueling as well, because some of those can probably be long enough distances. So as you mentioned, again, they're probably repeating on the way to the event. And the caffeine, there's no doubt there's a lot of caffeine going on over there. But as you know, caffeine is an ergogenic aid, so it can help performance. And, depending on the rider, some riders may not benefit as much as others. But what's really interesting about caffeine is, the amount of caffeine that one of these riders might consume at the beginning of a race, so 3 to 6 milligrams per kilogram of body weight. So let's say they're consuming 300 milligrams of caffeine. When they're tired, so if they're 3 hours into a race, they need less caffeine at that point to have the same effect as when they're fresh. So you might even have like caffeinated gels or, flat caffeinated something in some of the bottles later in the race to, again, give you that ergogenic effect, which is more focused from caffeine and a decreased sense of, really you're suffering less. So your perceived exertion is lower than it actually is because of caffeine. So there's certainly some evidence that, it's really dependent on your genes, and that's not for sure right now, but some people might not do as well on caffeine. And then there's always the whole notion that more is not better with caffeine. So once you get up over like 7, 8, 9 milligrams per kilogram of body weight, the way that it operates is actually blocking receptors. So when you have more, there's like a glass ceiling. So they know all of these things. They're probably timing their caffeine optimally based on when they want it to peak in their blood, and then also taking it during, as long as they have no adverse effects. And some of those can be GI for some people. So, but these are things they would all have completely dialed in for the Tour de France.
So these are extreme, cases, and these are world-class cyclists pushing themselves to the absolute limit day after day after day for 3 weeks. What are some of the takeaways for recreational, regular cyclists, weekend warriors? What can we take away from some of the things you shared with us and what we see the riders doing in these extreme situations that might make our riding, our training, and our racing a bit better?
Yeah, I guess that would go both ways. So I would say the positive takeaways would be, the Tour de France is very different than a one-day race. So there is a lot of time in there where these riders are, I think I read the other day, one of them, like, oh, what a boring stage. Like, I just sat in the peloton. It was so easy. And for us as, now we're recreational riders, but watching, we would think, how can they say that's easy? Like, they're cruising at 40K an hour, but it is when they're sitting in the middle of the peloton. So it is, I think it's actually difficult sometimes to watch what professionals in the Tour de France are doing and then extrapolate it to the recreational rider, because the scenarios are so different. Like a recreational rider going to do a 1-day race is not going to be dependent on, oxidizing more fat and all those things that in the Tour, when they're spending so much time at a moderate aerobic pace, that's very important. So I think the carbohydrate intake is always an important message, especially with social media and all these fad diets and people touting that you don't need them. If you're racing a bike race and there's high intensity and there's repeated efforts, you do need a high carbohydrate diet. You don't necessarily need the Tour de France, 10 grams per kilogram though, right? Because then you could be gaining weight. So it's all about fueling the work that you're doing. If you're doing a 1-day race for 2 hours, if you don't need to prepare in the capacity that these guys are doing, 5,000 to 8,000 calories a day, right? That's a very different situation. So you might still carb load a little bit, and you would figure out how much you would need based on your weight and your, duration and intensity of your event. But it is an important message, because I think there's a real fear of carbohydrates out there and a fear of weight gain from them. But as a competitive cyclist, if you want to be competitive and you want to get the most and have that top end, be able to respond and get up the snappy hills, I think one of the biggest messages is eat carbohydrates, have those glycogen stores, and of course hydration. We can never leave out hydration. You can watch these guys, the bottles are always going down. They're probably drinking at least 15, 16 of those 500 ml bottles per day. And, that hydration is power, right? We can't forget that. We tend to have that disconnect that water is just water, but our muscles are over 70% water, and it's such an important aspect of performance as well.
Stay hydrated. Now, and you added this in at the end, and I'm glad you did, is you wanted to talk quickly about bone health and cyclists, because over the long term, if you're a lifelong cyclist, there can be some negative ramifications to that. Did you want to sort of add something to the whole bone health conversation?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think it's such an important thing for cyclists to keep in mind, because the Tour de France is special in that it's 3 weeks. So, gladly, they will get off of their bikes and straighten back up again and put some weight down through their bodies. But it is a non-weight bearing sport, and there's certainly a higher risk of osteopenia, and even when you're older, osteoporosis and low bone mineral density as a cyclist. And that can be because of many conditions surrounding the sport. So because you're spending so much time cycling, you're not spending the time doing resistance training. And the most vulnerable areas are your lumbar spine and your hips. So it is so important for cyclists to be doing that weight bearing and meeting energy needs, right? Because even if you're doing the weight bearing, but you're neglecting energy needs, you still might be going into a headwind, so to speak, as far as maximizing bone health. And this is so important for young cyclists, because you have this opportunity to maximize your bone when, before 30 years of age. So if you're a young cyclist and you're only cycling and you're not meeting your energy needs, I mean, you're really putting yourself behind the 8 ball. It's not that you can't make up for it when you're young. That's the beauty of it. You still can, whereas when you're 60, that would be a lot harder. But yeah, I think it's such an important message, because it's something you don't feel, right? You don't feel your bone mass decreasing. So I always think, like, when there's an opportunity to just share that with cyclists, that we do need to be, getting in the gym or doing some plyometrics, as long as we're safe to do that. Even doing some running, some stairs, anything to put some weight down through your spine and your hips to maximize that bone accrual when you are young, so that you have a better chance of not getting osteoporosis, osteopenia, and even in men, right? Everyone always assumes this is just women, but we know that there are Tour de France riders who have the Z-scores of someone that's 60 years old. So that's not a mystery.
So just to be clear, so that the younger athletes, the cyclists in particular, might be a bit more vulnerable to that, but for sort of older folk, middle-aged older folk, I mean, is a daily walk, enough? Or you mentioned going up and down stairs. Is that enough sort of weight bearing and resistance to maintain proper sort of bone density, or might we be needing to add more to that?
I would suggest adding more. Heavy weightlifting, should you be given the okay biomechanically to do, is ideal. So literally lifting 80% of your maximum. But of course, if you have injuries, then you do what you can, but you have to realize, like, even if you're doing shoulder presses or whatnot, like, your maximum might not be heavy. So it is going to be relative to you, right? Something is always better than nothing. Walking is not a lot of weight, but again, it's better than not walking. But ideally, if you can be lifting heavy and your body is able to, definitely, and that might be something that you hire a trainer for, just to go through your biomechanics. If you do already have osteopenia or osteoporosis, there's certainly organizations like Bone Fit, where the trainers are very able to make sure that you're not doing exercise where your spine is in a vulnerable position, and all these things to keep in mind when you're lifting. Because at that age, there's a lot of people who do have osteopenia already and might have osteoporosis. So even, finding out if you do, it's not a bad thing either. But yeah, I mean, it's never too late to try and improve your bones, even if it's more difficult. It's certainly not impossible. It's just when you're young, everything, bone turnover happens a lot more rapidly, and you're still in a building mode versus a maintaining and then eventually losing mode. So yeah, it's important when you're young, but it's super important when you're older as well. And I think a lot of masters athletes are starting to see the light on that and lifting more and getting to the gym, because you also feel like, I don't know, do you lift? Like, do you just feel better when you lift?
Yes.
Right.
I do personally. Not a lot, but a little bit.
Yeah. So overall, you feel kind of healthier, stronger, and more functional. So I think that regardless of bone is also super important, right? We want to get rid of the hunch, and we have a lot of years ahead of us, hopefully. So just keeping, good functionality, I think, takes more than just riding the bike.
Well, that's a great note to end on, Anne. Really appreciate you sharing all of this important nutrition information, and then the bone density tips at the end. You've been watching the Tour Today show. My guest today has been sports nutritionist Anne Guzman. Again, thank you, Anne.
Thank you so much for having me on. I love what you're doing, and this is totally amazing. I look forward to seeing more of your shows.
My guest tomorrow for stage 15 of the Tour Today show will be the #1 ranked Zwift rider in the world, Holden Cameau. I'm Steve Fleck on behalf of the whole team at Endurance Zone TV. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you all back tomorrow at 5 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time for the next episode of the Tour Today show.